I still remember the exact sound the door made when my father slammed it behind me. Not just the sound, the feeling. The metal handle slipped from my fingers as the door shut, and for a moment I stood frozen on the porch of the only home I had ever known, staring at the wood as if it might open again if I waited long enough. I was 17 years old, pregnant, and suddenly homeless. Inside that house were the people who had raised me. The same people who used to clap at my school concerts and remind me to lock the doors at night. But in that moment, they had decided I no longer belonged to them. My father's voice still rang in my ears. "This house doesn't have a child like you. Leave." The porch light buzzed softly above my head while the night air pressed against my skin. My hands trembled as I held the small duffel bag I had packed only minutes earlier. What my father didn't know that night was this. 20 years later, he and my mother would walk into a glass tower in downtown Dallas asking for a business deal. And when the elevator doors opened, they would see me standing in the lobby, waiting. My name is Lillian Brooks, and the night my parents threw me out was the night my life split into two completely different stories. Before that night, my world had been small and predictable. We lived in Savannah, Georgia, in a quiet neighborhood where everyone knew each other's business, whether they admitted it or not. My father owned a construction company called Brooks Construction. Around town, people respected him. He was the kind of man who believed hard work solved everything, and mistakes were signs of weakness. My mother rarely disagreed with him. Growing up in our house meant understanding one simple rule: reputation came first. At church on Sundays, my father would shake hands with the pastor and talk about discipline and responsibility. At dinner, he reminded my younger brother and me that every decision we made reflected on the family name. Back then, I believed him, until the afternoon everything fell apart. I found out I was pregnant in the bathroom of a gas station just outside town. The test was cheap, the kind you grab quickly from a shelf without wanting anyone to notice. I locked the door behind me and sat on the edge of the sink while the small window above the mirror let in a stripe of pale afternoon light. 2 lines appeared before I was ready to see them. For a long time I just stared at the test in my hand, waiting for the lines to disappear. They didn't. My boyfriend Ethan was the first person I told. We had been dating since junior year, and for months I believed he would always be on my side. But when I showed him the test in the parking lot behind the school stadium, something in his expression changed. At first he said it must be wrong. Then he said we should keep it quiet. By the end of the conversation, he was talking about how his parents were planning to move to Florida soon, and how complicated everything suddenly was. Within a week, Ethan was gone. His family left town early, and the phone number he had given me stopped working. That was the first moment I realized I was alone in this. For several weeks I managed to hide the pregnancy from my parents. I wore loose sweatshirts and avoided family dinners whenever I could. Every morning I sat across from my father at the kitchen table while he read the newspaper and talked about work. And I wondered how long I could keep the truth from him. It didn't take long. One morning my mother found me kneeling in the bathroom, gripping the edge of the sink while morning sickness hit harder than usual. She stood in the doorway watching me for a long time before asking what was wrong. When I didn't answer, she demanded the truth. My father came in seconds later. I remember the kitchen table where we all sat down. The smell of coffee still filled the room. Outside, the neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had every other morning of my life. But inside that room, everything was about to change. When I finally said the words, the silence that followed felt endless. "I'm pregnant." My father didn't shout immediately. At first he simply stared at me as if he didn't recognize the person sitting across from him. Then he asked one question. "Who's the father?" When I told him Ethan had left town, his chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood up. He began pacing across the kitchen, running a hand through his hair while repeating the same words over and over. "You've embarrassed this family. Do you understand what you've done?" My mother sat quietly with her hands folded together, staring at the table instead of looking at me. I waited for her to say something. Anything. She never did. My father stopped pacing and disappeared down the hallway. A minute later, he returned holding an old duffel bag. He dropped it onto the table in front of me. "Pack what you need," he said. The words didn't make sense at first. But then he added the sentence I will never forget. "This house doesn't have a child like you. Leave." I packed slowly, folding clothes with hands that barely felt like mine. My childhood bedroom looked exactly the same as it had the day before. But suddenly it no longer belonged to me. As I walked down the hallway with the bag over my shoulder, my younger brother stepped out of his room. He looked terrified. Without saying anything, he pressed a small envelope into my hand. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Then he stepped back before our father could see him. A few minutes later, I stepped onto the porch. The door slammed behind me so hard the windows rattled. I stood there for a moment under the buzzing porch light, holding the envelope and the bag that now contained everything I owned. Then I walked down the driveway and out into the humid Georgia night. At the time, I believed my life had ended on that porch. I had no idea it was only just beginning. I walked for a long time after the porch light disappeared behind me. The streets in Savannah were quiet that night. The kind of quiet that makes every footstep sound louder than it should. I carried the duffel bag over my shoulder, and the envelope my brother had given me clutched tightly in my hand, afraid that if I let go of it for even a second, I might lose the only kindness anyone in that house had shown me. I didn't know where I was going. I only knew I couldn't turn around. After a few blocks, I opened the envelope under a street lamp. Inside were a few crumpled bills. Not much money, but enough to remind me that someone in my family still cared. That thought almost made me cry. Instead, I kept walking. My first idea was simple. I went to the house of a girl from school named Heather. We had studied together before exams and spent afternoons talking about college plans. I told myself that if anyone might help me for a night, it would be her. When I knocked on the door, Heather answered. At first, she smiled when she saw me. But when I explained what had happened and told her I needed somewhere to stay, her smile slowly disappeared. Her parents appeared behind her a moment later, and I could see the tension in their faces even before they spoke. Her father asked a few short questions. When he heard the word pregnant, his expression hardened. He said it was unfortunate, but that this was a family matter and they couldn't get involved. The door closed gently but firmly. That was the moment I understood something important. In a small town, shame spreads faster than kindness. I walked away before they could see the tears running down my face. By midnight, I reached the bus station on the edge of town. The building was almost empty except for a vending machine humming in the corner and a few tired travelers waiting for early morning departures. I sat on a plastic bench with my duffel bag beside me and stared at the cracked tile floor. I had never spent a night alone outside my home before. Every sound made me flinch. Every passing stranger made me nervous. But the fear that kept returning wasn't about the dark or the unfamiliar place. It was about the tiny life growing inside me. For the first time since I saw those 2 pink lines on the test, I realized that whatever happened next wouldn't just affect me. I wasn't alone anymore. Sometime near dawn, a woman sat down on the bench beside me. She looked to be in her 50s, with soft gray hair and kind eyes that seemed to notice things other people ignored. She asked if I had been waiting there all night. I tried to say everything was fine, but my voice betrayed me. She listened quietly while I explained just enough of my situation to make sense. I told her I had nowhere to go and that I couldn't go back home. She didn't ask questions that would make the story harder. Instead, she told me she volunteered at a women's support center in Jacksonville, Florida. It was a shelter that helped women who needed a place to start over. Then she asked if I wanted a ride. A few hours later, I was sitting in the passenger seat of her car, watching Savannah disappear behind us. I didn't know it then, but that drive was the first step toward the rest of my life. The shelter in Jacksonville was nothing like the home I had grown up in. The building was simple, with narrow hallways and small shared rooms. The furniture didn't match, and the walls were covered with bulletin boards full of job listings and community notices. But for the first time since leaving home, I felt something I hadn't expected: safety. The coordinator who ran the shelter greeted me like I was a person, not a mistake. She explained the rules, showed me where I would sleep, and told me about the counseling sessions and job programs available to residents. There were other women living there too. Some were escaping abusive relationships. Others had lost jobs or homes. A few carried stories even heavier than mine. Listening to them made me realize something important. Everyone in that building had been told at some point that their life was over. And yet they were all still standing. The next few months passed in a blur of exhaustion and determination. I found part-time work at a roadside diner washing dishes and eventually waiting tables. The hours were long, and the tips were small, but it was enough to start saving a little money. At night, I often sat at the small desk beside my bed and wrote letters to my parents in a notebook. I never mailed them. Sometimes I tried to explain that I hadn't meant to embarrass them. Other times I asked if they had ever wondered where I was, but the pages always ended up folded away in the drawer. When my daughter was born, the women at the shelter surrounded me like family. I remember holding her for the first time, staring at her tiny fingers wrapped around mine. I named her Ava. In that moment, something inside me changed. For months I had been surviving. Now I had a reason to fight. A few months after Ava was born, I found another job cleaning rooms at a small motel not far from the diner. The work was hard and sometimes humiliating, but it paid a little more than the diner shifts. One night, the motel manager asked if I could cover the front desk because another employee had quit without notice. I had never worked a desk job before, but I agreed. That night, I sat behind the counter answering phones and checking guests into their rooms. At first, it felt awkward, but after a few hours, I began noticing how everything worked. Reservations, room assignments, payments, guest complaints. The entire business flowed through that small desk. And for the first time since my life fell apart, I felt something unexpected. Curiosity? Maybe my future wasn't limited to surviving day by day. Maybe there was something more waiting for me on the other side of this long road. Late that night, the motel phone rang. I answered, expecting another reservation request. The voice on the other end asked if someone with the last name Brooks was staying there. For a moment, my heart stopped. But before I could say anything, the caller hung up. I sat there staring at the silent phone for a long time. Even after everything that had happened, part of me still wondered if my parents might one day come looking for me. But deep down, I already knew the truth. If I wanted a future for my daughter, I would have to build it myself. By the time Ava turned 3, exhaustion had become a normal part of my life. Every morning began before the sun rose. I would wake in the small studio apartment above the motel, careful not to make too much noise while Ava slept in the corner of the room. The apartment wasn't much more than a single space with a tiny kitchenette and a bathroom whose door barely closed properly. But it was ours. I made breakfast on a small electric stove, usually toast and scrambled eggs when we could afford them. After that, I dressed Ava for daycare and rushed downstairs to begin the first shift of the day. In the mornings, I worked at the diner. In the afternoons, I cleaned motel rooms. At night, when the motel was short-staffed, I worked the front desk. It was exhausting. But something had changed inside me after Ava was born. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building something, even if I didn't yet know what it was. One night during a front desk shift, the motel was nearly full when a large group of travelers arrived unexpectedly. They claimed they had reservations for 6 rooms. When I checked the computer system, nothing appeared under their name. The group leader insisted the rooms had been confirmed weeks earlier. The motel manager wasn't on site, and the guests were already beginning to raise their voices. For a moment, I felt panic rising in my chest. Then I took a breath and started checking the reservation logs manually. Within a few minutes, I found the problem. Another employee had accidentally entered the booking under the wrong date. The rooms technically existed in the system, but the timing had been recorded incorrectly. Instead of turning the guests away, I quickly rearranged a few assignments, upgraded 2 smaller rooms, and managed to fit the entire group into the motel. The situation calmed down almost immediately. By morning, the crisis had become nothing more than a story. But the motel owner had heard about what happened. Later that day, he called me into his office. I expected to be told I shouldn't have touched the reservation system without permission. Instead, he asked how I had solved the problem so quickly. When I explained what I noticed in the booking logs, He leaned back in his chair and looked at me differently than he ever had before. From that day on, he started asking me to help with small administrative tasks during quiet shifts. At first it was simple things: updating reservation spreadsheets, checking payment records, answering emails when he was away. But the more I worked with the numbers, the more something inside my mind woke up. I began to understand how the business functioned. The front desk wasn't just about greeting guests. It was the control center for the entire motel. Occupancy rates, seasonal demand, pricing adjustments. For the first time in years, I felt something other than exhaustion. I felt curious. One evening after Ava had fallen asleep, I searched online for ways to learn more about the hospitality industry. That's when I discovered the community college nearby offered evening courses in business administration. The tuition wasn't cheap for someone earning tips and hourly wages. But the idea of learning more about how businesses worked refused to leave my mind. For weeks I debated the decision. Every dollar mattered. One unexpected bill could throw my entire life into chaos. But eventually I realized something. If I kept living exactly the way I was living now, nothing would ever change. So I enrolled in one class. The first night I walked into that classroom, I felt completely out of place. Most of the students were younger than me and didn't carry the same responsibilities I did. But as the professor began explaining basic business concepts, I found myself leaning forward in my seat. Numbers made sense to me. Strategy made sense. For the first time since high school, I felt like my mind was opening again. My schedule became even harder after that. Work during the day, class at night, homework after Ava went to sleep. But slowly, small victories began to appear. Passing my first exam, finishing a presentation, understanding financial reports that once looked like a foreign language. Then one evening, a guest checked into the motel who would change my life without even realizing it. His name was Marcus Hale. He was a regional manager for a hotel group that owned several properties across Florida and Georgia. At first, he was just another business traveler staying a few nights. But during his second evening at the motel, the reservation system crashed unexpectedly. Guests were lining up at the desk while the computer refused to process any check-ins. I quickly switched to manual paperwork, checked guests in using printed forms, and called the system provider while keeping the lobby calm. Marcus watched the entire situation quietly from the corner. After the line disappeared, he approached the desk and asked how long I had been working in hospitality. I told him the truth. I hadn't been working in hospitality. I had just been trying to survive. A week later, Marcus returned during another trip. This time, he asked more questions about my work and the business classes I had started taking. Then he told me something I wasn't expecting. The hotel company he worked for was launching a management trainee program in Dallas. The program trained employees for leadership roles inside their hotels. It was competitive. Most applicants had college degrees and industry experience. But Marcus said he believed practical intelligence mattered just as much. He handed me an application form before leaving. That night, I sat at the small kitchen table in our apartment staring at the paper. The opportunity felt unreal. If I applied and somehow succeeded, Ava and I would have to move across the country. Everything stable in our life would disappear again. I looked over at Ava sleeping quietly on the couch beside me. For years, my biggest fear had been losing the little security we had built. But another thought slowly grew stronger in my mind. Maybe the real risk was staying exactly where we were forever. I picked up a pen and began filling out the application. For the first time since that night on my parents' porch, a new door was standing in front of me, and this time, I was the one deciding whether to open it. The first time I saw the Dallas skyline, it looked like a different planet. Glass towers stretched into the sky, reflecting the late afternoon sun in sharp lines of silver and blue. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter as I drove into the city. Ava sleeping in the back seat surrounded by boxes that held everything we owned. Jacksonville had felt big when I first arrived there years earlier. Dallas felt enormous. I had been accepted into the hotel company's management trainee program, something that still felt unreal every time I said the words out loud. Marcus had kept his promise and recommended me personally. But even with that help, I knew the opportunity came with a risk. If I failed here, I wouldn't just be losing a job. I would be losing the future I had imagined for Ava and me. The hotel company placed me in a downtown property for the start of the program. The building was 3 times larger than the motel where I had learned how to run a front desk, and the pace of the business moved faster than anything I had experienced before. Most of the other trainees arrived with degrees from hospitality schools and polished resumes filled with internships at luxury resorts. I arrived with a single suitcase of professional clothes and a past I rarely talked about. During our first orientation meeting, I could feel some of them studying me quietly, trying to figure out how someone like me had been accepted into the same program. I didn't blame them. Sometimes I wondered the same thing myself. But if they expected me to fall behind, they quickly realized they were wrong. I volunteered for every assignment the program offered. Morning meetings with department managers, afternoon rotations through guest services, accounting, and operations, late-night shifts when the hotel was short-staffed. Every part of the business fascinated me. The more I learned, the more I realized how complex the hospitality world really was. A hotel wasn't just rooms and reservations. It was a network of systems, pricing strategies, staffing decisions, marketing plans, and guest experiences all working together. And slowly, something surprising happened. The more difficult the assignments became, the more confident I felt. One afternoon, the hotel nearly lost a major conference group due to a scheduling mistake made by another trainee. Over 200 guests were scheduled to arrive within hours, and several of their reserved rooms had been accidentally double-booked. Senior managers gathered in the office trying to find a solution. I studied the reservation chart quietly for a few minutes before speaking. If we upgraded several small groups to larger suites and rearranged the conference block assignments, we could free enough rooms to keep the booking intact. The plan wasn't perfect, but it worked. The guests arrived without realizing there had ever been a problem. For the first time since I joined the program, the general manager asked me to stay after the meeting. He told me I had a talent for seeing solutions where others only saw problems. That moment stayed with me for a long time. Over the next few years, the company began assigning me to properties that were struggling, hotels losing money, motels with poor reputations, locations that corporate offices were considering closing. Instead of intimidating me, those assignments excited me. Because I had lived on the other side of the front desk, I understood what guests actually noticed and what they ignored. I knew which small changes could make a big difference. Better lighting in the parking lot, faster check-in procedures, staff members who were trained to solve problems instead of passing them to someone else. One small motel on the edge of Fort Worth had been losing money for years when the company asked me to evaluate it. Most executives believed the location was simply bad. But when I visited the property, I noticed something they had overlooked. A new shopping district was being built only a few miles away. If the motel improved its reputation before the area finished developing, it could attract an entirely new type of customer. Instead of recommending the motel be sold, I asked the company for permission to manage the turnaround myself. For months, I worked longer hours than ever. We renovated rooms with a limited budget, improved the booking system, and retrained the staff. Slowly, the numbers began to change. Occupancy rates climbed. Reviews improved. The motel that once struggled to fill half its rooms was suddenly turning a profit. That success gave me an idea I couldn't ignore. Many small hotels failed not because they lacked customers, but because they lacked good management. If someone could identify the right properties and fix the right problems, those businesses could become incredibly valuable. I began saving every extra dollar I earned. Eventually, with a small bank loan and a partnership agreement, I bought a minority share in that same motel. It was the first time in my life I owned a piece of a business. The feeling was terrifying and thrilling at the same time. From there, the idea grew. One property turned into two turned into 3. Eventually, I created a small management group that handled operations for several struggling hotels across Texas. I named it Horizon Lodging Group. At first, the company existed quietly in the background. Most people in the industry barely noticed it. But for me, Horizon represented something enormous. It was proof that the girl who once cleaned motel bathrooms had learned how to run the entire building. By the time Ava reached middle school, Horizon Lodging managed multiple properties across the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Our growth was steady, careful, and almost invisible to the larger companies dominating the industry. Until one afternoon when my operations manager walked into my office holding a folder. A real estate development firm had begun purchasing land around several of our hotels. At first it seemed like normal expansion activity. But as we studied the map more closely, a troubling pattern appeared. The same company was surrounding our properties on multiple sides. Their plan was obvious. If they controlled enough of the surrounding land, they could force smaller hotels like ours to sell or disappear. That evening, a formal proposal arrived on my desk. The development company wanted to buy one of Horizon's most successful properties. I opened the document expecting another standard corporate offer. But when my eyes reached the company name printed at the bottom of the page, something about it made my stomach tighten. The name felt strangely familiar, and I had the uneasy feeling that the past I had worked so hard to leave behind might be closer than I realized. The first time I heard the name Southern Crown Development, it didn't mean anything to me. It was just another company on a report my operations manager placed on the conference table during our weekly meeting. Horizon Lodging had been growing steadily for several years, and with growth came new competitors, new negotiations, and new challenges. But as the meeting continued, I realized this situation was different. Southern Crown wasn't simply buying a few random properties. They were buying land, strategically, parcel by parcel, block by block. They were surrounding several of the hotels Horizon Lodging managed across the Dallas-Fort Worth area. One of my analysts pulled up a map on the screen. Red circles marked the properties we owned or managed. Blue shapes represented land recently purchased by Southern Crown. The pattern was impossible to ignore. They were closing in on us. If they controlled enough of the surrounding property, they could build large developments that would make our smaller hotels irrelevant. Worse, they could restrict access roads, parking space, and local partnerships that our properties relied on. In other words, they could force us to sell. My legal advisor leaned forward in his chair. They've already made quiet offers to 2 other hotel owners nearby, he said. Generous offers. But strategic? That word stuck with me. Strategic. Southern Crown wasn't just expanding. They were planning a takeover of the entire hospitality district. A few days later, the first official offer arrived. They wanted to buy one of Horizon's most profitable boutique hotels, a property we had spent 3 years rebuilding from the ground up. The price they offered was high enough to tempt almost any business owner. But I knew exactly what it meant. If we sold that property, the rest of our hotels in the area would slowly lose value. The district would eventually belong entirely to Southern Crown. I declined the offer the same afternoon. That was the moment the conflict officially began. Curious about the company behind the pressure, I asked my team to investigate Southern Crown's leadership structure. Within days, they returned with a detailed report. The company was relatively new but growing rapidly. Its founders had experience in large-scale construction and real estate development across several southern states. One name on the list caught my attention. Not because I recognized the person, but because I recognized the connection. Southern Crown had several major construction partnerships, and one of their primary contractors was a company based in Georgia, Brooks Construction. For a long moment, I simply stared at the report. Brooks was not an unusual name. But when my legal advisor began reading additional details about the partnership agreements, the truth became impossible to ignore. The company was the same one my father had spent his entire life building. I leaned back in my chair, suddenly feeling the strange weight of the past pressing into the present. For 20 years, I had built my life believing I had escaped the world I came from. And now, somehow, it had circled back around. That night, I sat alone in my office long after my team had gone home. The skyline outside my window glowed with city lights, while I turned the report pages again and again, trying to process what it meant. Did my father know my company existed? Did he know Horizon Lodging was operating in the same development zones his construction firm was working in? Or was this just coincidence? The questions followed me home. When I opened the apartment door, Ava was sitting on the couch with a box beside her. A box I recognized immediately. Inside it were old notebooks and letters I had packed years ago when we first moved to Dallas. Ava held one of the letters in her hands. "Mom," she said quietly, "why did you write letters to people named Brooks?" For a moment I couldn't speak. Those letters were the ones I wrote during my first months in the shelter. Letters to my parents that I never mailed. I walked slowly into the room and sat beside her. She asked if those people were our family. I had avoided this conversation for years. But Ava was old enough now to understand. So I told her, not every painful detail, but enough. I told her about the house in Savannah, about the night I was forced to leave, about the years it took to rebuild our lives. Ava listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked one simple question. "They never tried to find you?" I shook my head. No. She looked down at the letters again, as if trying to imagine what kind of grandparents could walk away from their daughter. Then she hugged me tightly. "You did okay without them," she said. Her words stayed with me the next morning when my legal advisor called with new information. Southern Crown had sent a formal request for a negotiation meeting. They wanted to discuss a potential partnership with Horizon Lodging rather than continuing to compete. The meeting would take place the following week at our headquarters in downtown Dallas. My assistant forwarded the document to me a few minutes later. I read through the list of attending executives slowly. Then my eyes stopped on one name. Frank Brooks, Senior Development Advisor. My father. For 20 years, I had wondered what it would feel like to see him again. Now I knew. He was coming to my building, and he had no idea who he was about to meet. The morning of the meeting arrived faster than I expected. I woke before sunrise, long before the alarm clock on my nightstand had a chance to ring. The apartment was quiet, except for the distant sound of traffic beginning to move through the city below. For several minutes I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands. In a few hours, I would see my parents for the first time in 20 years. The thought didn't bring the anger I had imagined for so long. Instead, it carried a strange calm, the kind that comes when you realize the person you used to be no longer exists. Ava walked into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "You're up early," she said. "Big meeting today?" I replied. She nodded, grabbing a piece of toast before heading back toward her room to get ready for school. I watched her for a moment, thinking about how much of my life had been built around protecting her from the pain I once carried. Today, the past was walking straight into my present. By 8 o'clock, I was in my office at Horizon Lodging headquarters. The building stood in the center of downtown Dallas, a glass tower that reflected the sky like a mirror. From my office window, I could see the city stretching in every direction. 10 years earlier, I had arrived in Dallas with a borrowed opportunity and a sleeping child in the back seat of my car. Now I owned the company occupying the entire 23rd floor of this building. My executive team gathered in the conference room to review the negotiation strategy. Southern Crown wanted Horizon Lodging to manage the hospitality operations inside several luxury developments they planned to build across the region. If the deal worked, Horizon would expand faster than we ever had before. If it failed, the competition between our companies could become aggressive and expensive. My legal advisor reviewed the contract clauses while my operations director explained the potential growth projections. Everyone spoke in the calm language of business. No one in the room knew the real reason my hands felt slightly unsteady when I turned the pages of the proposal. Frank Brooks. The name sat there in the document like a ghost from another life. At 10:30, my assistant called from the reception desk. "The Southern Crown team just arrived," she said. I stood up slowly. For a moment, I considered staying upstairs and letting the meeting begin without me. But something inside me refused that idea. For 20 years, I had lived with the memory of a door slamming behind me. Today, I would not hide from the people who closed it. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. The ride down felt longer than usual. When the doors opened, the sound of conversation filled the space. The lobby was bright with morning sunlight streaming through the tall glass windows. Several executives in dark suits stood near the reception desk reviewing documents and greeting members of my staff. And among them were two faces I had not seen since I was 17. My father stood near the front of the group, his posture still straight and confident. His hair had turned gray, but his voice carried the same sharp authority I remembered from childhood. My mother stood slightly behind him, quieter as always. For a moment they didn't notice me. I watched them from across the lobby, feeling the strange distance that time creates between people who once shared a life. These were the people who had erased me from their world. And yet here they were, standing in the building I had built. Eventually, my father glanced in my direction. At first, his eyes moved past me. Then he looked again. Confusion crossed his face. He stepped closer, studying my expression like someone trying to remember a half-forgotten photograph. My mother followed his gaze. The color drained from her face. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, my father approached. His eyes narrowed slightly as recognition settled in. "Lillian," he said slowly. I nodded once. He glanced around the lobby as if trying to understand why I was there. "You work here?" he asked. The assumption didn't surprise me. In his mind, the daughter he threw out years ago probably still existed somewhere at the bottom of the world. Before I could answer, one of my assistants hurried toward us. "Brooks," she said politely. "The boardroom is ready. The directors are waiting for you to start the meeting." My father frowned. "The CEO isn't here yet?" he asked. My assistant looked confused. "She is," she replied. Then she turned toward me. "Whenever you're ready." For a moment, the entire lobby seemed to fall silent. My father looked from the assistant back to me, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. Then a slow, mocking smile appeared on his face. "So," he said, his voice carrying the same dismissive tone I remembered from the kitchen in Savannah. "Did life finally teach you a lesson?" I held his gaze without raising my voice. "Yes," I said calmly. "It did." Then I pressed the elevator button again and gestured toward the doors. "Let's go upstairs," I told them. "You're here to see me." The elevator doors closed behind us, and the silence inside the small space felt heavier than any argument. My father stood beside me with his arms crossed, staring at the floor indicator as the numbers climbed toward the 23rd floor. My mother stood slightly behind him, her hands clasped together as if she were holding on to something invisible. None of the Southern Crown executives spoke either. They were clearly trying to understand what had just happened in the lobby. My father's question still hung in the air. "Did life finally teach you a lesson?" For 20 years I had imagined answering that question in 100 different ways. Now that the moment had arrived, the words felt simple. "Yes," I said quietly. "It did." The elevator stopped with a soft chime. When the doors opened, my executive assistant was already waiting in the hallway. "This way," she said, guiding the group toward the boardroom. Several members of Horizon Lodging's leadership team stood as we entered the room. "Good morning, Ms. Brooks," one of the directors said. The greeting was routine, something they said at every meeting. But in that moment, it carried a different weight. My father slowed his steps. He looked from the directors to me and back again, confusion replacing the confidence he had shown in the lobby. We took our seats around the long conference table. The Southern Crown executives placed their folders in front of them and began organizing their notes. My father remained standing for a moment. "Wait," he said. He turned toward me again. "You're telling me you run this company?" I met his eyes. "I own it," I replied. The room fell completely silent. One of the Southern Crown executives cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the personal tension unfolding before the meeting had even begun. I opened the presentation folder in front of me. "We can begin whenever you're ready," I said. The discussion started with the usual formalities: market reports, projected development timelines, financial models. I spoke the same way I had spoken in dozens of negotiations before this one, walking through Horizon Lodging's portfolio of properties and our management strategy for boutique hotels across Texas. But even while I explained occupancy rates and development projections, I could feel my father watching me, not with anger, with disbelief. 20 years ago, he had looked at me like I had destroyed his family. Now he was looking at me like he was seeing a stranger. Eventually, the meeting reached the core of the negotiation. Southern Crown wanted Horizon Lodging to manage the hospitality operations for several luxury developments they planned to build across the region. If we agreed, Horizon would expand into markets we had never entered before. But there was one condition. I closed the financial report and folded my hands on the table. Horizon Lodging is interested in the partnership, I said. Several executives nodded immediately. But I continued before anyone could celebrate too early. There's an additional requirement. The room grew quiet again. I slid a new document across the table. For every development included in this partnership, I said, a percentage of the project's housing allocation will be dedicated to transitional living units for single mothers. A few executives exchanged surprised looks. My father leaned forward slightly. What does that mean? He asked. It means, I said calmly, that these projects will include affordable housing units connected to employment and childcare support programs. One of Southern Crown's financial officers frowned. That would reduce profit margins. Short term, I said. But long term, it strengthens the community surrounding the developments. The discussion that followed lasted nearly an hour. Some executives resisted the idea at first. Others saw the value in the public support it could generate for the project. Through the entire conversation, my father said very little, but I could feel his attention shifting. He understood exactly why I had chosen that condition. Because once a pregnant teenager had nowhere to go. Eventually, the chief executive of Southern Crown leaned back in his chair. If Horizon Lodging signs the management contract, he said slowly, we can agree to the housing initiative. The decision was made. Contracts were revised. Signatures were added. Just like that, the deal became one of the largest partnerships Horizon Lodging had ever secured. The executives began gathering their documents. Some congratulated me on the agreement before leaving the room. Within minutes, the boardroom was nearly empty. Only 3 people remained. My father, my mother, and me. My father stood near the end of the table, staring at the skyline through the glass wall. I didn't think you'd survive, he said quietly. The honesty of the statement surprised me. When you walked out that night, he continued, I thought life would break you. I didn't answer immediately. Outside the window, the Dallas skyline stretched across the horizon. Life did teach me something. I finally said. He turned toward me again. What's that? That you can build something powerful after people stop believing in you. For the first time since he arrived that morning, my father didn't have a response. My mother was the one who finally spoke. Lillian, she said softly. Could we talk? The door to the boardroom closed behind the last departing executive. For the first time in 20 years, my parents and I were finally alone. The boardroom felt strangely quiet once the door closed behind the last executive. For a moment, none of us moved. My father stood near the window with his back half turned toward me, staring out over the Dallas skyline like he needed something solid to focus on. My mother remained seated at the long table, her hands folded tightly together. 20 years had passed since the last time we had stood in the same room. Back then, it had been a kitchen in Savannah. Now it was a glass boardroom 23 floors above downtown Dallas. The silence stretched long enough that I almost thought no one would speak. Then my father finally turned around. I didn't know, he said. His voice sounded different than it had earlier that morning in the lobby. The sharp certainty that used to fill every sentence had softened into something more uncertain. You didn't know what? I asked. That you survived. The words were blunt, almost uncomfortable. He walked slowly toward the table, resting his hands on the back of one of the chairs. When you left that night, I thought life would crush you, he admitted. I thought you'd come back eventually. I looked at him for a long moment. I did think about coming back, I said. Both of them looked at me quickly. There were nights in Jacksonville when I had nowhere to go and almost no money left. I continued. Nights when the only thing I wanted was to knock on that door and ask if I could come home. My mother's eyes filled with tears. But you didn't, she whispered. No, I said. Because even back then, some part of me knew that if I walked back through that door, nothing in my life would ever change. My father slowly lowered himself into one of the chairs. What happened to you? He asked quietly. After you left. So I told them, not every detail, but enough for them to understand the years they had never seen. I told them about the bus station where I spent my first night alone, the shelter in Jacksonville where strangers helped me find a place to sleep, the diner shifts, the motel rooms I cleaned while carrying a baby inside me. I told them about Ava, how she was born surrounded by women who barely knew me but treated me like family anyway, how every job I worked and every class I took was for her future. Neither of my parents interrupted. They just listened. By the time I finished, my father's shoulders looked heavier than they had when he first walked into the building that morning. I didn't know you had a daughter, my mother said softly. She's 17 now, I replied. The words hung in the air for a moment, the same age I had been when everything changed. My father closed his eyes briefly. A granddaughter, he murmured. Yes. Another long silence passed between us. Finally, my father looked up again. There's something I need to understand, he said. You could have destroyed that deal today. He gestured toward the stack of contracts still lying on the table. Southern Crown needs Horizon Lodging more than we admitted in that meeting. If you had rejected the partnership, our entire development plan would have been delayed. He paused. Why didn't you? The answer came easier than I expected. Because revenge gets boring after a while. He frowned slightly. For years I thought success would feel like proving you wrong. I continued. Like one day you'd see me and realize you made a mistake. I glanced toward the window. But that's not really what happened. What do you mean? My mother asked. It stopped being about you. The truth settled into the room slowly. I didn't build Horizon Lodging to get even, I said. I built it because Ava deserved a better life than the one I started with. My father looked down at the table. And the housing program? He asked quietly. The one for single mothers. I nodded. When I was pregnant, there were moments when one safe place to sleep could have changed everything. If these developments are going to reshape communities, they should also help the people who need it most. My father exhaled slowly. I spent 20 years believing you ruined your future, he said. And I spent 20 years learning how to build one. For the first time that day, his eyes met mine without pride or judgment. I was wrong, he said. The apology was simple. No dramatic speech, just the truth. My mother reached across the table toward me. Is there any chance, she asked quietly, that we could know our granddaughter? I didn't answer immediately. Forgiveness isn't something that appears the moment someone asks for it. But I also knew something else. The anger I once carried had already faded long before they walked into this building. We'll see, I said. It wasn't a promise. But it wasn't a rejection either. A few minutes later, they left the boardroom together. I remained standing by the window, watching the city move beneath me. The girl who had walked away from a house in Savannah with a single duffel bag would never have believed this moment was possible. But life has a strange way of turning closed doors into new roads. That evening, I returned home to find Ava sitting on the couch with a bowl of popcorn and her laptop open. How did the big meeting go? She asked. I smiled. Better than I expected. She tilted her head. That sounds mysterious. Maybe one day I'll tell you the whole story, I said. But for now, we just sat together in the living room, talking about school and weekend plans while the city lights flickered outside the window. And for the first time in a long time, the past felt like something that had finally settled behind me instead of standing in my way. Sometimes the people who push us out of their lives end up pushing us toward the life we were meant to build. And sometimes the greatest form of revenge isn't revenge at all. It's living well enough that the past can no longer define you. If this story resonated with you, I'd truly love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had someone doubt you or walk away when you needed them most? Share your experience in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about resilience, family drama, and those moments when life turns the tables in unexpected ways, make sure to stay here with the channel and subscribe. There are many more stories like this one waiting to be told.